Hello, this is Miss Bratcher here for Business Law, and on the docket today we are going to be learning about the federal court system. What is a federal court? It's a court that exercises its judicial power that was allocated to it by the federal government through the U.S. Constitution. And here I have a sample of the inside of one of the federal courts that we have. Over here I have a chart that displays each of the districts. So there are federal courts in all of these districts that you see on the chart numbered here. What I'd like for you to do now is share with us a federal court that you are aware of. If you don't have any ideas, you can go to the website uscourts.gov, and it will explain everything you need to know about federal courts. It's also in your book, Chapter 3-2. We've got Supreme Courts, District Courts, and Appellate Courts. There are 12 circuits, and each of those have a Court of Appeals. And now let's see if we can put these in order. At the top, we've got our U.S. Supreme Court. And this just kind of shows you the structure. The U.S. Supreme Court is the highest court. We've got our state Supreme Court over here on the side. Our district courts, our special courts, and our agencies, like the FDA, can all appeal their decisions to the U.S. Court of Appeals. If it needs to go even further, it would then head up to the Supreme Court. So the big question is, how did we get all of these courts? How did they come about? So what it started with was we had George Washington's inauguration. And 6 months later, Congress meets up. They pass the Federal Judiciary Act, which ordained and established, this is our Federal Judiciary Act, what we know today as the U.S. Supreme Court and the other federal courts. And this is what the Supreme Court looks like today. And then eventually, they even created other courts as certain matters arose. Like, for instance, maybe you own some land and you need to pay your taxes on that land, but you don't have any money. So they created special tax courts. So now the question comes down to who's in charge of what and who has the power to create these courts. And the way that it works is the Constitution gives the courts the power to adjudicate these cases, and the Congress gives the courts or has the power to establish these courts. And adjudicate just means to make a formal judgment. Now, although we have all these different kinds of courts, they each can only hear a certain kind of case. So we have what we call jurisdiction. A court that has original jurisdiction means it's the first court to hear a dispute at the federal level. A court with general jurisdiction can pretty much hear any kind of case. Things that are federal matters would be questions about the Constitution and U.S. treaties. We also have diversity of citizenship cases. That means you've had some kind of dispute between two different people who live in two different states, and the amount must be over $75,000. Or it could be a person from the United States who has a dispute with someone from a foreign nation in an amount exceeding $75,000. And that would constitute as diversity of citizenship. Now, at least one of these parties would need to request that the federal courts hear this. Otherwise, it could still go to a state court. Well, what if someone at one of the lower courts isn't happy with the decision? They can appeal it, and it can go to one of our courts that have appellate jurisdiction. We have 13 federal courts of appeal that you can see on this map, and each of them are assigned to a certain geographic area. Appellate courts do not accept any new evidence. So if it wasn't mentioned in the original trial, it cannot be mentioned in the appeals court. And they do not call witnesses. They have appellate jurisdiction, which means they hear the case the second time around. What they do is review trial transcripts. They look at appellate briefs and oral arguments. Once they've skimmed through those, they're going to make a decision about the issue of law. So what was it that the parties were not happy with in the first trial? And then they will make a ruling. And finally, our highest court, the United States Supreme Court. This is what the United States Supreme Court looks like. Here's an overhead view of where it's located. It can have original jurisdiction, which means it hears a case for the first time, However, that's only on cases that affect ambassadors or other public ministers or consuls. Mostly what it focuses on is its appellate jurisdiction. So it hears cases the second time around and only talks about issues of law. It gets those cases from the U.S. Court of Appeals or the highest court at the state level, which would be our state Supreme Court. And these decisions are final. Only the United States Supreme Court can overturn its own decisions. And sometimes, maybe cases aren't even appealed to the United States Supreme Court. They can look down and order a lower court to go ahead and turn that case over to them if they believe that it's a constitutional issue. So keep in mind, we have 3 levels of courts at the federal level. We have the Supreme Court, the Federal Courts of Appeals, and the Federal District Courts. You want to keep in mind that each of those courts has a different type of jurisdiction: original, appellate, or general. We even have specialized courts which deal with a special things such as taxes. In this lesson, let me give you one little case. So the jury in Martin's case convicted him of grand larceny, partially based on the evidence found in the trunk of the car he was driving. The state appellate court, which has appellate jurisdiction, here's that case for the second time, upheld his conviction. The United States Supreme Court, however, took jurisdiction over the case by issuing a writ of certiorari to the state Supreme Court. The USSC, on appeal, then held that the search of his trunk that discovered the items was an improper search. The United States Supreme Court overturned his conviction, as the jury could have been improperly influenced by such evidence. That is the way that a case could move through these courts.